It was 11:47 at night when Robert sat alone at the edge of his bed, the house completely quiet around him. His wife of 34 years was already asleep. The bedside lamp cast a dim amber glow across the room, and he stared at the wall as if the answer to his question might somehow be written there. Something had changed, something he couldn't explain to anyone, not his doctor during those rushed 10-minute appointments, not his son, and certainly not his wife. He felt fine, he looked fine, but something inside him had quietly shifted, and he had no idea whether it was something he should panic about or simply accept as the price of growing older. He didn't know it yet, but what he was experiencing had a name. It had causes, and more importantly, it had answers. The moment everything changed. Robert was 63 years old. He had spent his entire career as a civil engineer in Ohio, raised 2 kids who were now grown with families of their own, and considered himself, on most days, a reasonably healthy man. He watched what he ate, most of the time. He walked the neighborhood every morning when his knees allowed it. He had his annual checkup, took his blood pressure medication faithfully, and had even quit smoking 11 years ago, a victory he was quietly proud of. By almost every measure, he was doing what a man his age was supposed to do. He had earned the right to feel settled. But lately that settled feeling had been disturbed by something he couldn't quite name out loud. It had started a few months ago, gradually the way most things that unsettle a man begin, not with a crash, but with a quiet erosion. He had noticed it first in a moment of intimacy with his wife Carol. Everything had felt normal, completely normal. The closeness, the warmth, the sensation that had defined that part of their relationship for over 3 decades. And then at the very moment he had expected the familiar physical conclusion, there was nothing. No fluid, just the sensation. And then an eerie, hollow silence where something used to be. He had said nothing. He had gotten up, gone to the bathroom, and stood there staring at himself in the mirror for a long moment before quietly going back to bed. He told himself it was probably nothing, a fluke. Maybe he was tired, or maybe it was the new blood pressure medication his doctor had adjusted last spring. He decided to wait and see. But it happened again, and then again. Each time the experience itself was the same. The feeling was there, perfectly intact, but the physical evidence was simply absent, as though someone had removed a piece of the machinery without telling him. And with each recurrence, the silence in the bathroom grew louder. He began to ask himself questions that men of his generation were never taught to ask out loud. Was this a sign of something serious? Was his body failing him in some fundamental way? Was this the beginning of a longer unraveling? He began Googling late at night, which only made things worse, the internet offering him a terrifying buffet of possibilities ranging from the trivial to the catastrophic, with no way to tell which applied to him. What Robert didn't know, what most men in his position don't know, is that what he was experiencing has a medical name. It's called dry ejaculation, or in clinical terms, an ejaculation or retrograde ejaculation, depending on the specific cause. And contrary to the stories his fear was telling him in the dark, it is not a sign that his masculinity has expired. It is not a verdict. It is not an ending. It is, in the words of the urologists who treat it every single day, a message, a detailed, specific message that the body is sending, waiting patiently to be decoded. The human reproductive system is, when you step back and truly look at it, a remarkable piece of engineering. Think of it as a perfectly timed orchestra, each section performing its role at precisely the right moment. The testicles produce sperm. The seminal vesicles, 2 small glandular pouches tucked behind the bladder, produce the bulk of the fluid, the rich, nourishing liquid that makes up most of what is released during climax. The prostate gland adds its own protective fluid to the mixture. All of this is gathered in the urethra, ready for the moment of release. When climax arrives, a powerful sequence of rhythmic muscle contractions propels that carefully assembled mixture forward and out through the urethra. It is a rapid event, a marvel of synchronized timing between nerves, glands, and muscles, and for most of a man's life it happens seamlessly, without a second thought. But here is something that many men and even many doctors who don't specialize in urology fail to fully appreciate. Climax and ejaculation are not technically the same thing. They feel like the same thing because for most of life they occur together as one seamless event. But they are driven by completely separate mechanisms. Climax is a neurological event. It is governed by the brain and the nervous system. That overwhelming surge of sensation and release that has nothing to do with fluid. Ejaculation is the physical, mechanical act of expelling the fluid outward. Most of the time they happen in perfect sync, but when the mechanical side of the system is disrupted, for any one of several very specific, very treatable reasons, a man can experience the full neurological pleasure of climax, while the physical delivery of fluid either goes somewhere it shouldn't, or simply doesn't happen at all. Robert lay awake that night not knowing any of this. He knew only that something had changed, and that he was scared in a way he couldn't admit to anyone. He thought about his father, who had died of prostate cancer at 71, and the thought lodged itself in his chest like a stone. He thought about Carol, about whether she had noticed, about whether she was quietly worrying too, about whether this invisible thing between them would slowly grow into a wall neither of them could see over. He was not by nature a man given to anxiety. He had managed job losses, financial stress, the death of both parents, and a health scare with his eldest daughter. He was someone who got through things, but this was different. This was happening inside a part of his life that had always felt private and certain, and now it felt uncertain, in a way that had no clear edge. What Robert needed, what every man in his position needs, was not more terrifying search results at midnight. What he needed was a clear, calm, medically grounded explanation of exactly what was happening inside his body, why it was happening, and what realistically could be done about it. He needed to know that he was not alone, that in urologists' offices across America, men exactly like him, men of 60 and 65 and 70, men who had spent their entire lives being strong and self-sufficient, were sitting in those same waiting rooms with the same unspoken question. He needed to know that the answer, in most cases, was not devastating. It was, in fact, manageable, but he didn't know that yet. He was still sitting at the edge of his bed, staring at the amber-lit wall, waiting for morning. 3 reasons the body sends this signal. Robert finally made the appointment. It took him 3 weeks to do it. 3 weeks of internal negotiation, of telling himself he would call tomorrow, of picking up his phone and putting it back down. But he made it. His urologist was a calm, unhurried man named Dr. Harmon, who had been in practice for over 20 years, and who had the particular gift of making men feel that nothing they said in his office would ever be met with judgment. Robert sat across from him and told him everything, and Dr. Harmon listened to the whole thing before he said a single word. Then he leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "Robert, I've heard this story hundreds of times, and I want you to know that in the vast majority of cases, we find a clear reason, and we find a clear path forward. Let's start at the beginning." The most common reason for what Robert was experiencing, Dr. Harmon explained, is something called retrograde ejaculation. To understand it, you have to picture a small but critical piece of anatomy, a muscular valve that sits at the exit of the bladder, sometimes described as a gatekeeper. Under normal circumstances, when a man reaches climax, this valve clamps down tightly and firmly, ensuring that the seminal fluid has only one direction it can travel, forward, through the urethra, and out. But when this valve is too relaxed, when it fails to close with the necessary force, the fluid following the path of least resistance flows the wrong direction. It travels backward, into the bladder. The man feels every sensation of climax perfectly and completely, because that sensation is neurological, not mechanical. But when he looks for the expected physical result, there is nothing there. The fluid has gone the wrong way. What causes this valve to relax? Dr. Harmon explained it to Robert in language that finally made the whole thing make sense. Certain surgeries, particularly procedures on the prostate or the bladder, can affect the delicate network of nerves that control this tiny valve. The surgery may be completely successful in its intended purpose, solving whatever problem it was designed to solve, and yet in doing so, it may alter the nerve signals that tell that gatekeeper muscle to clamp shut at the right moment. The procedure works exactly as designed, but the body's extraordinarily precise plumbing has been modified in a way that changes that one specific function. Robert's blood pressure medication, the one his doctor had adjusted last spring, was also a factor Dr. Harmon wanted to explore. Certain medications used to treat high blood pressure and enlarged prostate work by relaxing smooth muscle tissue throughout the body, and that tiny bladder valve is smooth muscle. The medication doing its intended job on blood vessels can, as a side effect, also relax the valve that keeps fluid moving in the right direction. Robert thought about the patient Dr. Harmon mentioned, a proud, accomplished man who had come into his office after a successful prostate procedure, devastated, convinced that something had gone terribly wrong, and Dr. Harmon had sat with him and drawn him a simple diagram and explained it in terms of a traffic light stuck open, not a failure, not damage, not an omen, just a mechanical alteration, a specific identifiable change in the plumbing. The man had walked out of that office with something he hadn't had when he walked in, a framework for understanding what was happening to him. And that framework, Robert was beginning to understand, was everything. When you have a name for something, when you understand its mechanism, it loses most of its power to frighten you. The second possible cause Dr. Harmon walked Robert through was an obstruction, a blockage somewhere in the delicate network of ducts, through which seminal fluid travels on its way out of the body. Picture the seminal vesicles and surrounding glands working perfectly, producing fluid exactly as they should. But imagine that somewhere along the delivery route, one of the small passages through which that fluid must travel has been narrowed or closed. The fluid is being produced, but it has nowhere to go. The volume at the point of climax drops drastically, or disappears entirely, not because of any problem with production, but because of a blockage in the pipeline. These obstructions, Dr. Harmon explained, can develop from scarring left behind by past infections, a severe case of prostatitis, inflammation of the prostate that went untreated or undertreated years ago, can leave behind scar tissue that gradually narrows those small passages. In rare cases, small calcifications, essentially tiny stones similar in concept to kidney stones but far smaller, can form within those ducts and block the flow. Some men with this type of blockage notice subtle warning signs that they had never thought to connect to this issue. A mild new discomfort in the pelvic region during climax, something that wasn't there before, something easily dismissed as muscle tension or aging. A gradual change in the quality of the fluid over time, becoming thicker and less abundant over a period of months or years, before finally diminishing significantly. These are signals the body was sending all along, quiet, easy-to-ignore signals, the kind that men of Robert's generation were trained to push through and not speak of. The encouraging news, Dr. Harmon said, is that many obstructions are very treatable. Medication to address ongoing inflammation can sometimes resolve the issue. In cases where physical blockage is confirmed, minimally invasive procedures can often restore normal flow without major surgery. The pipeline can, in many instances, be reopened. The third cause Dr. Harmon wanted to evaluate was hormonal, specifically the possibility of low testosterone. Robert had heard the term before, had seen the advertisements on television, but had never seriously considered it as something that applied to him. Dr. Harmon explained that testosterone is far more than the hormone associated with desire and strength. It is in a very real sense the fuel that powers the entire male reproductive system. It regulates not only sperm production and libido, but also the optimal function of the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles, the very glands responsible for producing the bulk of seminal fluid. When testosterone levels drop significantly, the entire system slows down. Fluid production decreases. The quality and intensity of climax can diminish. The physical result of that climax, the volume of fluid, reflects that slowdown directly. And the effects don't stop there. Men with significantly low testosterone often notice changes that spread across their entire quality of life. Fatigue that doesn't resolve with sleep, shifts in mood that feel unfamiliar and hard to explain, a gradual loss of muscle mass despite maintaining the same level of activity, a general dulling of the sharpness and energy that used to feel effortless. These changes come on slowly enough that many men attribute them simply to aging, to the inevitable wearing down that they've always been told to expect. But Dr. Harmon was direct with Robert. There is a meaningful difference between the natural, gradual changes of healthy aging and the changes caused by a specific hormonal deficiency. One is an inevitable process, the other is a treatable medical condition. A simple blood test can tell the difference. And if low testosterone is confirmed, carefully managed hormone replacement therapy can often restore not only fluid production, but energy, desire, mood, and overall quality of life in ways that men frequently describe as transformative. Robert sat in that office and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become relief. He had walked in carrying something shapeless and heavy, a fear with no name and no edges. He was walking out with something entirely different, a map, 3 specific identifiable reasons, 3 clear avenues of investigation. A doctor who had heard this story before and who was not alarmed. He drove home through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, thinking about how much energy he had spent being afraid of something that it turned out had a name. The road back to confidence. The blood work came back within a week. Dr. Harmon called Robert personally, which Robert took as either a very good sign or a very bad one. It was neither. It was simply the kind of doctor Dr. Harmon was. The results showed that Robert's testosterone levels were measurably low, not catastrophically so, but well below the range that supported optimal function for a man his age. His medical history, combined with the blood pressure medication he was taking, pointed strongly toward retrograde ejaculation as the primary mechanical cause. Dr. Harmon laid out a plan. They would start with a medication adjustment, working with his cardiologist to explore whether an alternative blood pressure medication might be less likely to affect the bladder valve. They would also check a post-orgasm urine sample to confirm the retrograde component, and they would begin monitoring his testosterone with an eye toward hormone therapy if the levels didn't respond to initial interventions. It was a real plan. It had steps and a sequence and a timeline. For Robert, that was almost as important as the treatment itself. But the conversation that changed things most for Robert that week was not the one with Dr. Harmon. It was the one with Carol. He had been avoiding it for months, not out of indifference, but out of something more complicated. He had grown up in a household where men handled their problems privately, where asking for help was something you did only when the situation had become genuinely critical, where vulnerability between spouses was an unspoken transaction. You protected them from worry by keeping your worry to yourself. He had internalized that code so completely that he hadn't even fully recognized it as a choice. It simply felt like the right way to be. But 3 months of silence had created a distance between them that Carol had felt without understanding its source, and Robert had felt without knowing how to close it. He told her everything on a Tuesday evening after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with the dishes still in the sink. He told her about the first night it happened, about the weeks of quietly Googling at midnight, about the appointment with Dr. Harmon, about the blood work and the plan. And Carol, who was a woman of deep practicality and even deeper kindness, listened to all of it and then reached across the table and put her hand over his and said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" It wasn't a reproach. It was a genuine question, asked with the patience of a woman who had spent 34 years learning the architecture of her husband's silences. And Robert found, to his own surprise, that he didn't have a good answer. He had protected her from something she hadn't needed to be protected from. He had carried alone something that shared weighed almost nothing. This is the part of the story that medicine alone cannot address, and it is in many ways the most important part. The physical causes of dry ejaculation, the relaxed valve, the blocked duct, the low hormone, are real, and they matter, and they deserve medical attention. But the emotional weight that accumulates around this experience in the months before a man seeks that attention is, for many men, the heavier burden. Men of 60 and 65 have grown up in a culture that taught them to equate physical performance with worth, not consciously, not in any way they would ever articulate out loud, but deeply, in the wordless grammar of how they learned to think about themselves. When that physical performance changes, something in the internal accounting system registers it as a loss of something fundamental. The feeling of inadequacy doesn't announce itself as irrational. It arrives dressed as fact, but it is not fact. It is a story the brain tells when it has incomplete information and too much silence in which to tell it. The fact is this: a man's ability to feel pleasure, to be present with his partner, to experience the closeness and connection that intimacy offers, none of that is determined by the presence or volume of seminal fluid. The neurological experience of climax is entirely separate from its mechanical result. The warmth of lying next to someone you have built a life with is entirely separate from both. Robert had not lost any of these things. He had been so focused on the one thing that had changed that he had failed to take account of everything that hadn't, and it took Carol's hand on his, across the kitchen table, to help him see the full picture again. Over the following weeks, Robert began to notice changes, small ones at first, then more significant. The medication adjustment made a difference. Dr. Harmon confirmed retrograde ejaculation through the urine test and began a careful, monitored course of hormone therapy targeted at his specific deficiency. Robert didn't expect the broader effects of that therapy, and they surprised him. Within about 6 weeks, he was sleeping better. The low-grade fatigue he had attributed to simply being 63 began to lift in a way that felt noticeable and real. He found himself wanting to take his morning walks again, not out of discipline, but out of something closer to desire. Carol noticed it too. She said he seemed like himself again, and he realized that for the past several months he had been a slightly muted version of himself, present but dimmed, going through the motions of his own life. There is a broader lesson in Robert's story that extends well beyond the specific medical details. Men of his generation, and many men of younger generations too, have been taught to manage their health problems the way they were taught to manage most problems, quietly, privately, and preferably without troubling anyone else with the details. The annual physical is fine. A trip to the emergency room for something acute is justified. But the kind of slow, private, intimate concern that Robert carried for 3 months, the kind that doesn't announce itself as an emergency but quietly erodes quality of life from the inside, that kind of concern gets tucked away, sometimes for years, and in the meantime treatable conditions go untreated. The distance grows, the fear compounds. The man sitting at the edge of the bed at midnight becomes more isolated, not less. The 3 causes Dr. Harmon walked Robert through, retrograde ejaculation, ductal obstruction, and low testosterone, are in the vast majority of cases manageable. The diagnostic process is not complicated. A conversation, a physical exam, a blood test, a urine sample. The tools required to find the answer are not sophisticated or frightening. What they require is a man willing to make the appointment, willing to say the words out loud in a doctor's office, willing to accept that seeking information is not weakness. It is, as Robert came to understand it, the most functional expression of the self-sufficiency his generation had always prized. You don't fix the problem by ignoring it. You fix it by finding out exactly what the problem is. There is also the matter of when to move quickly. Dr. Harmon had been clear with Robert on this point, and it is worth being equally clear here. If dry ejaculation arrives suddenly, without obvious explanation, and is accompanied by pain in the pelvis, during urination, during climax, that changes the calculus entirely. If there is blood in the urine or in the fluid, if there is fever or a loss of sensation in the genital region, or neurological symptoms appearing alongside the change, these are signals that require prompt evaluation, not watchful waiting. Conditions including certain neurological diseases, long-standing uncontrolled diabetes, and in rare cases, specific urological cancers can interfere with the nerve signals and plumbing that control this system. In those cases, the message the body is sending is urgent, and it deserves an urgent response. The difference between a manageable mechanical issue and something that requires faster intervention often comes down to the presence of these accompanying symptoms. Pay attention to them. Robert's story ended the way most of these stories end, when a man finds the courage to begin them, not with a dramatic resolution, but with a quiet, durable restoration of something that had felt lost. The intimacy between him and Carol didn't return to exactly what it was before. It returned to something better, because it was now built on honesty rather than protected silence. His energy returned in a way he hadn't anticipated. His sense of himself as a man, not just physically, but in the deeper, fuller sense of a person living with intention and presence, came back solidly, without the low-frequency hum of unaddressed fear underneath it. He continued seeing Dr. Harmon every 3 months for monitoring, kept his blood pressure in check, and walked his neighborhood every morning when his knees allowed it. If you are reading this and you recognize Robert's story, if you have been sitting at the edge of your own bed, in your own amber-lit room, carrying a question you haven't yet said out loud, then this is what you need to hear. You are not alone. What you're experiencing has a name. It has causes. The vast majority of those causes are not catastrophic, and most of them are treatable. The path forward begins with a single appointment and a willingness to say the words in the room. Your body is not failing you. It is sending you a message, the way bodies do. Not with a megaphone, but with a quiet, persistent signal, waiting for you to pay attention. Pay attention. Make the call. The information you're waiting for is on the other side of a conversation you haven't had yet. And that conversation, as Robert would tell you from the other side of it, is far less frightening than the silence.